Okay. So we want to give as much time as possible to today's conversation. So let's get started. First of all, happy Halloween. Woo! Thank you all for joining another session of our Sustainability Lunch Series. My name is Jen Graham, Senior Associate Director of the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. And before I hand the microphone over to our student facilitator, I just wanted to share with you a few additional upcoming events that we're hosting that we don't want you to miss out on. So the first one is happening next week, same time, same place. We're hosting a panel of MIT founders who are specifically working in the renewable energy space. We're partnering with the MIT Sloan Climate and Energy Club on this conversation. So if you're interested in signing up, you can scan the QR code on the screen or sign up on Sloan Groups. The other event that we are hosting is happening 2 weeks from now. Again, same time, same place. And we are hosting two MIT Sloan sustainability alumni who are both in C-suite positions within their organizations. And they're going to talk all about their experience in corporate sustainability. This is frequently a top requested area among students who are seeking opportunities. So this will be a really fruitful conversation. So again, it's happening on November 14th. You can sign up via Sloan Groups. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our student facilitator today, Ella Kamlanvi. Ella is a second-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, specializing in finance, strategy, and sustainability. Prior to Sloan, she worked at Wells Fargo and the IFC, focusing on financial services and development finance. Ella is passionate about supporting diverse founders and addressing challenges in financial inclusion, education, and clean energy. Ella currently serves as co-president of the MIT Impact Investing Initiative, where she is committed to driving impact through innovative investments. So please welcome Ella. And Ella, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks so much for this great introduction. And I'm very excited to be here to facilitate this discussion with our guest speaker, Kate Barron. And I'll just go right ahead and introduce Kate. So Kate is Director of Impact and Financial Advisor at Abacus Wealth Partners, a founding B-Corp. Kate serves on the boards of Taproot Earth, a global climate justice organization, and the Francesco Collaborative Spirituality and Economic Systems Change organization. She previously served as a member of the Abacus Board of Directors. And prior to entering finance, she spent 15 years in social justice and social change, works in nonprofit and academia. Kate is a certified financial planner and holds an MSc in International Development from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and a BA in International Relations from Boston University. Kate currently lives in Philadelphia with her family. So I'm gonna give it up for Kate. Kate, thank you so much for joining us. And we know you have a very busy schedule. We'll just kick off with some icebreakers. So first question is, if you weren't working in finance or impact investing, what's something else you would have done?
Great question, Ella. Thank you for facilitating us and getting us started. I've had a lot of different paths in life, so I've done a lot of things, but I think one thing that remains is to be maybe more of a storyteller. If I were to be in a different version of me, I might be a documentarian, for example, and telling stories through images, I think is very powerful, especially, in this day and age, to get people to pay attention and to learn new things and take action.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing. And then second question is, if you could give your 25 years old a piece of financial advice, what would it be? And I think this will go in a room for all of us here, MBAs, who are almost graduating and planning our financial lives.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wonder if you asked this of everybody, because I think you should. My 25-year-old self thought she knew plenty already, and she probably did know lots of things, the power of saving, compound interest, things like that. But I actually think the wisdom I would give her today would be, finance is about the flows of money. And I think I would encourage her to think about a daily practice of generosity and really what it is to circulate money from a place of gratitude and sufficiency, really feel that, and particularly circulate money in a non-hierarchical way, sort of giving it around as opposed to maybe a top-down charitable way. So that actually is my unconventional financial advice for a 25-year-old. Give
Wow.
more every day.
Thank you so much. And as we transition into discussing more about your career journey, can you please tell us more about like how you made the decisions and how you end up into your current role today?
Yeah. My 25-year-old self would also be shocked that I work in financial services, just to put that on the record. I don't, you never know where life will take you. And I think if you're open to continuing to ask questions and learn and be challenged, who knows where you'll be in another couple of decades. So my career and my education really started at a very high level, thinking globally, studying international development, as you mentioned, and the flows of resources, particularly at the international, global, multilateral organization level. Thinking a lot about poverty outside the U.S. And so that's kind of where I got my start. And then pretty soon into that, I just had a thought about my own position in the world as an American and where my power really could be used and what I really probably was best positioned, where I was best positioned to influence change. And I came back to the US and was focused on advocacy, but then I also found myself working in post-disaster recovery long-term with a global humanitarian aid agency, but here in the US. And that was an incredibly pivotal professional and personal moment for me. And I would say it really introduced me to the world of NGOs and financial flows by way of philanthropy and sort of federal and state money and all of those things that, how money flows inside those particular systems post-disaster. But it also gave me very important lived experience of what it is to work with people who are on the front lines of something really hard, where money really could make a really big difference. And there's a lot to be learned from having that experience that is not something you read about or watch on the screen, right? So that was another phase of my career. And eventually it got me very curious about where the money was coming from and why it didn't go to where I thought it maybe would have gone. And a long story short, got me wondering where does the financial flow come from that funds philanthropy and nonprofit work, NGOs. And I also found myself very passionate about understanding the day-to-day, how money works for the people around me. And so that micro and that macro curiosity led me, and the desire to work with people, to be honest. I really like working with people, thinking practically, but also thinking strategically and at a level of systems. Decided to become what's called a certified financial planner, which is a particular designation, a CFP, to work with individuals, families, mostly, sometimes institutions and foundations, but around their money choices. So that's what spurred me from one place to the other, and really got from the very, very macro to, in some ways, very micro. How do individuals make very intimate choices about their money? And how does that impact the way wealth flows when it comes to investments, when it comes to which kinds of businesses get resourced, how tax money is allocated or raised. So those are all a very fast way to run through the arc of my career. Hopefully that helps.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And as you work at the intersection of both finance and social impact, like what are some of the main challenges you would say you've had to overcome or that you have to overcome at pretty much every day in your day-to-day work?
It's a good question. It's a hard question, I think, to constantly toggle between identifying the challenges and finding ways around them. I think for many of us, a lot of this work is emergent, and there wasn't a cadre of people doing this work, the generation before us. So some of that is just being able to navigate uncertainty and ambiguity is a challenge. At the level of individuals making investment choices, I think for some people, it's just helping them become aware that it's even possible to be thinking about integrating their personal goals and their financial choices. And It also is about educating my peers who maybe studied strict finance and didn't think about the sort of impact side of things, and helping them see how the dots connect, and so that they can translate that to clients as well. Another challenge is sort of access and who's got the ability to make these choices and who doesn't. I think that's a real challenge in terms of kind of democratizing access to impact investing and aligned money choices. Another challenge is kind of in the marketplace of values aligned investment, for example, like the options that are available, particularly options to invest in fresh new voices, different backgrounds of the status quo. Like how can we support more of those entrepreneurs or fund managers to have a shot at making it? And just sometimes at the level of society and structurally, a challenge is cognitive dissonance, right? Understanding that there are some massive problems that we're dealing with as a society in the global north, in the US, but also globally, and yet also working inside a financial system, a capital system that just assumes limitless growth with no questions around it. So at all those levels of challenges, you can't let it paralyze you, but you can't be ignorant to them if you really want to have an impact. So those are all real.
Awesome, thank you. And as we transition more into the trends, can we talk a bit about B Corps for corporations? And then I would love to hear your thoughts on like how have B Corp certification standards evolved in the past few years, and especially in relation to climate impact and sustainability?
Yes. Let me not assume that everyone knows what a B Corp is. So a B Corp, B kind of like as in benefit, but a B Corp is actually a third-party designation that an organization called B Lab created, I think around the year 2007. And it allows companies who are trying to model more of a holistic, triple bottom line approach to how they run their business. It gives them a rigorous, data-driven third-party assessment that results in being labeled as a B Corp. So with that explainer out of the way, the company that I work with, Abacus Wealth Partners, we were a founding B Corp, and one of the first financial services companies to be a B Corp. So what that has traditionally meant, starting in 2007 until now, is you go through a data collection process. There's almost a bit of an audit by the B Lab team around different factors of your business, from how your customers, your supply chain, your involvement in the community, et cetera, et cetera. I think there are about 5 or 6 categories that there historically been. And you answer questions, you provide resources to back up your answers, and you're scored. And as long as you reach 80 out of a total of 100, you can be a B Corp. So one of the big changes that's still underway, hasn't fully rolled out, but they're anticipating rolling out, will be about how scoring happens in certain categories. But I just want to mention something else, which is you can get that score, as long as you tally the points, you can get that score however you can. So you might be able to be weak in certain categories traditionally, but you could make up for it in others. And a B Corp, once you're certified, every 3 years you go through it again, right? So we've been doing this every 3 years since 2007, currently just finishing up our most recent recertification. But the next recertification process will be for the first time under completely revamped standards. And as you can imagine, a lot has changed in the world of frameworks, of measuring impact, of fears of greenwashing, et cetera. A lot has changed since 2007. So, and the B Corp movement has grown exponentially from maybe a dozen or so companies who were the first movers like ours to now, I think it's close to 8,000 companies around the world. So, and the companies can vary in sizes, they can vary in industries, they can vary in geographies. The new standards that are proposed will actually require that companies meet a basic threshold across, I think it is 10 or 11 categories. So you can no longer be super weak in some and super strong in others and make it through. Now is going to really have to call for an up-leveling of all the B Corps to be able to get that designation and hold the designation. When it comes to climate, I think they're getting much more specific in terms of what is going to be required. So, for example, the draft version of the new standards include things that weren't really there before, like your company will have to annually measure greenhouse gas emissions and report. Your company will have to have science-based targets and have set, and you're going to have be implementing a climate transition plan. So those are some kind of new and very specific and precise requirements in the climate part of the assessment. There's also an environmental stewardship and circularity component or section. So that'll be new for some companies. If your company, especially if your company makes, manufactures goods, for example, as a service-based company, it would look a little bit different in terms of what's demanded from us. But the overall trend is they're really wanting to keep that credential very prestigious and very, true to what the intention is for it, that it's not an easy thing to get. It's not a rubber stamp, but rather there's rigor and integrating different frameworks also from around the globe, since B-Corp, B-Lab is now global. There are different jurisdictions and different regulatory regimes, let's say the EU versus the US. And so they need criteria that's going to satisfy sometimes the most rigorous regulatory structures, and it forces everyone else to have to up level too, even if you're not there. So I think those are how the standards have evolved. And I think the impact of those standards evolving for B Corps is going to be, hopefully it really holds and maybe even increases the value of that designation and that certification for companies. If more customers of the next generation know what it is, appreciate how hard it is, right? It becomes a really great selling point for a company. Also to attract and retain employees, right, who want to work in something like that. But it also is going to require understanding all of these features at the level of strategy. So in the boardroom, in the C-suite, really thinking about this work integrating across the company and really resourcing the work to be done is going to be another big challenge. You can no longer sort of scramble. If companies did scramble in the last, in the final months before the recertification is due, you have to be doing the work all throughout because it's going to be harder.
Thank you for sharing that. I can imagine it's getting even harder for corporations to implement these B Corp standards. And you've mentioned greenwashing, which I think is one of the greatest barriers that we encounter in the impact investing field. I would love to hear more about your insights on how you think greenwashing is affecting the credibility of climate-related investments, and also how should investors define those red flags when it comes to climate-related investment? How are you advising your clients, for instance, around greenwashing?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think that the tendency, well, actually, first let me define greenwashing, and it's kind of obvious, right? But it is a company using kind of a veneer of seemingly environmental or social good through imagery, through words, through maybe commitments that don't necessarily require much on the other side, using that to try to position themselves with the marketplace, with customers, as being very aligned, very forward thinking, taking action with whatever they're projecting, but not actually doing that behind the scenes. So that's my definition of greenwashing, or co-opting buzzwords, to make it sound like they know what they're talking about. When it comes to investing, I think that the reality is there are, you have to look at each individual investment. I mean, we kind of know that you have to look really closely. The lenses you use really makes a difference. So part of that is being clear on what lenses you're using and why, and what lenses you're not using and why. And probably if you're in an institution, there are philosophical and sort of organizational choices that are made about what those lenses are. From the vantage point of an individual, retail investor, potentially, it's around what lenses align perhaps to my values and to what I'm trying to do by investing money in the first place. I think I don't know if I would call this a red flag. I mean, a red flag is sort of okay, they've got this imagery, but then what are they doing? And so how do you know what they're doing? I think Part of that is, are they beyond the selling of the investment on the way in the door? Are they continuing to report on it and, report on the impact? And I think I would even, it's worth saying that the non-financial reporting is new and emergent and evolving and imperfect. There was a time decades ago when financial reporting wasn't required and it wasn't systematized. So there may be a time, hopefully in the future, where we progress on how we do reporting of impact of investments. But at the very least, you want them to be making an attempt at it, and you can be making, having discussions about it, and maybe even saying what is imperfect about the reporting that they're able to do, or the metrics they're able to get. I think another red flag for greenwashing, especially at the level of large publicly listed companies, is how does their marketing or their stated mission statement, and maybe any statements they've made around climate, for example, how does that align with where they're spending their political and lobbying dollars? So to be making proclamations about signing pledges for climate, but then to be through perhaps membership in certain industry groups, you might be putting your political dollars into doing the exact opposite that you're marketing. So that's a huge one, connecting the dots around where the money is actually going, with trade associations in particular, or the own institutions, corporate political donations. And I mentioned this before too, another red flag or just thing to check out is, have they moved beyond, have they signed a pledge, let's say for climate? If they signed it, did they abandon it, or are they still in there, right? So as we're watching this move, some companies in different sectors are abandoning pledges that they had made for different reasons. So understanding why, could be some nuance there, would be good to know about, but it also might, those nuances might invite opportunities for engagement down the road, right? But also perhaps they signed a pledge, and so like, what's the so what what happens, right? Have they come up with kind of like, B Lab is asking B Corps, have you come up with a climate action plan, a transition plan? In large publicly listed companies, that's going to come down to, are you using a rigorous framework like the science-based target initiatives? How are you doing this work, and who's in charge of this work? Those are all things that, just basically like, what's the plan? What are you actually doing? Where are you actually putting your money? Those are just basic and smart places to assess what a company really stands for.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And now shifting gears towards the ongoing wealth transfer, it's clear that, the younger generations, like most of us in this room, are redefining the way investing is being done. What are key differences that you observe in the philanthropic preferences of millennials and Gen Z compared to like baby boomers?
That's a good question. I think the philanthropic preferences of baby boomers first was a little more of like the traditional approach to charity of a wall, speaking of cognitive dissonance, just let me make all the money I can here, and then take 5% potentially, or whatever percent, it depends on how you structured, from a foundation or otherwise, but take some portion of that money that I made with the sole intent of making money, and then try to help charitable causes. A lot of the charitable causes of the baby boomers and the older generations were more sort of like cultural art causes, let's say, or a lot of giving goes to religious giving. I think the next generations are more willing to think critically about how they're making money in the first place, and what they want to be a part of with that, what choices they want to make on the investing side, so they don't see it as necessarily separate. And then therefore turning to the philanthropic side and thinking more like, what is the role of giving? And there's, what are the different, who are the people on the other end of this transaction? What is the power of the donor? I think there are in the younger generation, there's some trends around, on the one hand, folks really interested in kind of this more technocratic, metric focused, doing the most good kind of effective altruism approach that in some circles is popular. And I think, that approach really sees the donor as sort of the central quantifier and judge of what is the ultimate and best good, with other donor-like organizations helping assess that. That's one approach that may be sort of different from what's gone before. But in some ways, it's a little bit, it's not so much a status, like a new trend. But there are other approaches that are more about, questioning the role and the power inside the dynamic of giving philanthropically, and what is the power and position of the donor, as opposed to the receiving community, for example, and thinking about, again, an approach that is kind of intersectional, thinking about justice. What is the source of this wealth that I'm now giving away? What communities were impacted by the creation of this wealth? What resources were taken from where, so that this wealth could be made? How could the philanthropic giving I do be a form of repair? That's a conversation that I think some younger philanthropists, are asking. And they might also be thinking about the timing and the tempo differently. Knowing what we know about what's happening with climate, there are definitely a lot more younger folks who are making philanthropic choices who want to move faster, who may even want to redistribute, as opposed to have just a long approach that it might be for their lifetime, or wait until they're in their 70s to begin giving away. So the timing is also a big difference. The sense of urgency is very big. And, as opposed to centering themselves as donor, to really trying to build relationships with communities who are on the front end of the problems, and to encourage their voice in the creation of the solutions, and step back from kind of to control that too much. So those are two different approaches, contrasting to the kind of more classic traditional approach.
Thank you so much. And I would love us to switch our focus to climate action in finance, discuss fossil fuel divestment and shareholder engagement, which have been very popular topics recently. So I'd love to hear how you think about fossil fuel divestment versus shareholder agreement as tools for corporate climate finance.
Mm-hmm. My short answer is yes to both. Right? It should not be an either or. I think there's some complexity and some nuance, and different people might decide to go different ways. But essentially, there are two tools that you have at your disposal as an investor, depending on your own values, what you want to do, what you think is impactful. You may deploy one or the other, or both. But so if we start with divestment, meaning you do not want to own those investments or those companies or those industries, right? Like we see now in Israel and Palestine, as this came up again with on college campuses in the past year, private prisons historically, South Africa and the apartheid movement, examples of campaigns for divestment getting really loud and heard. And I think it's a great approach for people who want to be just very in alignment with their values. If they don't want to hold a private prison investment, they just divest from it, right? So that is an approach. And some people take kind of an integrity sense, an integrity choice. And also, the more people do it, the more you're raising awareness around the issue, right? That, where is money being spent? How are choices being made? What is it supporting? And even kind of raising stigma around certain practices or geographies or companies can be helpful. That said, we have increasingly complex financial instruments. So much, it can get quite hard to parse out and have this pristine, not entangled investments that don't touch an industry or don't touch a geography. So it can get really hard to be super pure, I think, is kind of the practical truth of it. And if you're divesting, you have to put your money elsewhere, right? So that could be a good thing. You might be putting it to things that you want to encourage, but it also is whatever you're buying, whatever you're selling, someone else is buying, right? So it's not that share that you owned, you're going to divest from, is just going to be retired from the world. But the other complexity about divestment is the power of divestment is when it's a mass movement. I think research has shown that you need upwards of 85% of investors to pull out, to divest, for the company to feel the impact on their cost of capital, right? So it just is like a very, I mean, in like a 1% impact on their cost of capital. It has to be a really huge movement for it to hurt the company, right? In a way that affects their bottom line. So that said, there are ways you can do it, right? It can be done on an individual level, particularly for clients who hold like separately managed accounts with stocks. They can individually decide how they want to divest. But you can also be in more kind of collective investment products like a mutual fund where you're picking your manager based on how they're doing divestment or how they're doing maybe more coalition work across the sector to pressure it, knowing that like, it really does come down to numbers to make a difference. So that's divestment. I think another strategy that could be strategic, right, at the same time, or in kind of collectively, would be to hold and try to engage, right? So on an engagement side, especially when we're talking about issues that are systemic, so you can't, it might impact all the companies, right? So how can you influence the companies you hold to try to pressure them, and also to kind of fan out and influence other companies in their sector? Again, going back to the examples of political lobbying, transparency, those are things that if you want to see a company do better on, you have the ability to push for that and ask for that transparency when you're a shareholder through shareholder resolutions, right? So, and just bringing those issues up is a powerful form of having an impact in public market investment anyway. And we would do that. I've worked with clients who do that work, who do all of this, but just in the example of engagement, who do that work in partnership with the assets that they hold, as long as they've met the SEC's criteria for how long and how much they have, then they can collaborate with some amazing nonprofit partners like As You Sow and others who are doing the engagement kind of strategy and campaign work, and then need the shares to be able to file resolutions, can work a bigger strategy with that. So, one of the biggest ways to have sort of impact with teeth when it comes to engagement is voting out board, like individual members of boards and companies. I mean, that is actually an enforceable vote. So it's a powerful strategy as an investor. So I think divestment has its place, has its reason, is a part of a bigger conversation, but so does engagement. And I think even separate from that, in the realm of policy outside of being an investor, like it really does matter what regulations are passed so that they will change something systemically across the sector, which will encourage and kind of make all the companies implement change. And sometimes we see examples of campaigns for divestment and engagement have led to policy change as well. So that's a great example of that, is around forced arbitration for sexual harassment clauses in companies, where that really was an issue that a coalition of investors fought on for years from a divestment and engagement angle, and eventually led to some legislation being signed at the federal level about 2 years ago.
Thank you so much. And staying on the topic of the different strategies that firms are using, can you share more about what you're seeing other wealth management firms, like what are they doing to adapt their impact investing strategies to meet like the rising client demand?
Mm-hmm. I think that we've seen different kind of waves, right? The larger trend is toward having more impact investing strategies and offerings, for sure. We're living in pretty tumultuous political times where different things with acronyms are getting pushed back on in the US context. But the bigger trend globally, when we see what's happening with like EU regulation, for example, is towards more transparency, more values alignment, investment offerings, and more demand from the next generation. So companies are going to have to kind of take a longer view on this than the short-term kind of political chatter. But I think some of the strategies are, it depends on the type of company we're talking about. I think being able to look with more rigor at the investments and not take them at face value is important. It's going to require more education and knowledge by the people who work inside investment firms to be able to discern, right? Again, we were talking about greenwashing, to discern what is on offer. We kind of use 3 different lenses at Abacus for how we look at our own strategies when it comes to impact in a portfolio. And we've talked about 2 of them, right? One of them is divestment. So what is the divestment approach of this particular investment? And we need to be able to communicate that to a client so they can decide if that's sufficient or not for them. The second one is engagement. So how is the manager, or if it's an individual holding, what are the possibilities for doing engagement with this investment? And the third is actually just investment. So can you put more dollars and more influence behind certain practices, industries, companies, new managers, new funds, new companies, how you can use your dollars to not just divest, but also invest and engage. And I think the last thing that firms like ours are really needing to beef up, as I said before, is how we're not only marketing and encouraging people to come in and get into these investments, but continuing to report on them, follow through with managers, follow through with companies, and use the voice as we have as a firm, as an advisory firm, to lean on other firms down the food chain to make sure that we're doing our work as well, and continuing to tell the circular conversation back to the clients about what's happening. And sometimes that might involve telling them things don't look, they're not moving as fast as we would want, or there was a snag somewhere, and be able to understand why. Why did carbon emissions go up instead of down in one year? There are definitely nuance to be able to understand and communicate.
Thank you. And I remember that during one of our prep calls, you mentioned being an intrapreneur within the organization, as you wear so many hats. For those also aspiring to becoming intrapreneurs within traditional organizations, are there any advice that you could, share with us in order to overcome the challenges that will come along the way?
Yeah. My mom always told me, bloom where you're planted. So sometimes it's great. It's wonderful to think like, oh, maybe there's some other opportunity elsewhere. But I think wherever you are, there's opportunity. And so it really is about, I think, knowing that, right? And being curious, asking questions, coming from a lens of, what's missing, what's not happening. That's also helpful if you're straddling different worlds. Maybe you're in your company, but you're part of other circles outside of your job that help you see different perspectives. So you can bring that back and forth. That also gives you community, right? So being an entrepreneur can be really frustrating, right? And so having community, having maybe some allies inside the organization that you work, who can see things differently, or maybe give you some perspective that you're not seeing, can be really powerful. But also having allies and community outside is also very powerful for the navigating how hard it is to be at the forefront in an organization trying to do something that has never been done before. But being led too by your own curiosity and your desire to learn, like I said at the beginning, like I've had many twists and turns, and a lot of that has been asking questions and realizing that there's something I understand here, and I actually want to understand it, right? So following those questions that come up for you, those are really good breadcrumbs for where your own unique path will unfold and what's needed. And if you have that inner motivation, that inner curiosity, it's just going to kind of fuel and fire the work that you do. And it's also you're going to be infused with a lot of creativity as you move. So I think, community, toggling inside and out for perspective, following questions and curiosity, having allies with other vantage points inside the organization are all crucial. And really thinking about, what do you want to learn? What do you want your portfolio of work to be? Like over the course of your career, what's something you want to have contributed to maybe in this moment in time and history? And for work, particularly around climate, for example, but this is not the only topic. A lot of it is emergent. There's no expertise on many of these topics yet. And so the expertise you develop is based on where you're standing, and just knowing really well the context you're in and what is possible and building your expertise right there in that little corner of the world.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And before we wrap up, I'd love for you to share any advices that you have for us current MBAs looking into transitioning and maybe impact investing or sustainable asset management. Like, what are some of the key skills that you look for, and any general advices?
Well, a little bit like my financial advice to a 25-year-old, I have an unconventional approach to this, but I came into finance from an unconventional path. And I think that one of the the best key skill I think you can have, there's two in this work, especially in this moment in time, is number one, being able to communicate with people is big. Being able to tell stories, being able to translate, being able to take numbers and turn them into layman's language is a really important skill to have. Because no matter whatever organization you're in, you're going to need to translate at some point. So that's really powerful. And then I think another piece of advice I would give is to take time, if you haven't already in your life, or you haven't had the lived experience, to roll up your sleeves and actually be in community with the people on the other end of what corporations and companies do in communities, just real people. I think that kind of reality check and grounding is very important for those of us who work in very esoteric, removed work of finance. It's very removed from the real economy. And I don't think that's a good thing for where we are as a people and as a planet. So the more your skill set involves, you have lived experience with the impacts of the investments. And maybe that sounds like, for some people, like, oh, I already have that, that's easy. And for some people might be like, I don't even know where to begin. I think maybe you can just start with an issue or an industry or a geography and find a very micro way to be doing something closer to the ground. And that you might do that in parallel to your work life, but I think it's going to make you much better and savvier, and have much sharper instincts than someone who just maybe knows things off of the computer screen,
Thank you so much. And we'll just open the floor for more questions from students. Yes.
During your various answers, you've mentioned both political lobbying, alignment, and also kind of acting as an investor more effectively within a board. I was wondering if you have any take on how those can be better coordinated to create a bigger impact, so that basically, there's board alignment and government alignment to help companies move in the right direction in a way that also creates a renewing financial incentive for them to continue moving in a more sustainable way.
Board alignment and government alignment, is that what you're saying? I want to make sure I'm getting your question.
Basically, do you think there's an opportunity for better alignment between people working in sustainable investing or sustainable activist investing and people working directly through lobbying to make sure that there's coordination in those efforts to create more of a reinforcing cycle versus conflicting efforts in those domains?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in coordination and collaboration in general. So definitely, I mean, the what I was talking about too is a lot of the lobbying is really, in the example of fossil fuels, for example, the United Airlines was a company that was spending a lot on political donations in support of fossil fuel extraction, kind of the politicians supporting that work. So yeah, I think that coordination is good. I'm trying to locate sort of where in the food chain of different players this would be happening in. Are you talking about publicly traded companies in particular?
Yeah, especially publicly traded companies. But I think what you just mentioned is really what I'm trying to get a better understanding of, is like who in the ecosystem can actually lead some of this coordination. I mean, I feel that it needs to happen. It sounds like you feel it needs to happen. Is this like beholden on financial institutions like yours? Is this the responsibility of companies, but we know they already have split objectives and they're not aligning them investment with their claims? Like, who can we expect to do this, and how can we help?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now I get your question very clearly. Yes. So I think where this comes in, so a key role that investors have is by engaging, right? Calling on these companies to their boards in particular to mandate kind of transparency reporting around political spending. Once that work, so that's investor pressure that brings that to the attention of the board and all the investors. The decision is made to go ahead and do that. It doesn't take a huge percentage of vote to get that kind of on the forefront of a company from a sense of risk and pressure, reputational risk in particular. Once that report is out there, that data can be used for advocacy work, right? Bringing that to different parts of the government to push for change. But we need the data transparency to be able to have some teeth around, well, what's actually happening. If it's not made visible, it's really hard to advocate for change. So I think that's a role that identifying which companies need that work is important work that groups like I mentioned a nonprofit called As You Sow, that they've been a leader at doing that, is sort of strategically scanning what are the issues, what level of transparency and accountability is needed, which are the companies that could be most strategic to target, partnering with investors to get the shares to push that work in the hopes that it leads to data transparency that can then influence policy, lobbying. It could also influence how other managers decide to invest or not invest in those companies, especially if they have a mandate that aligns with the results of that report, or it is not aligned with the results of the report. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, please. What is just your perspective for a future carbon credits market?
Well, it's not my lane of work at Abacus. We don't touch that, I would say. I have seen some asset managers we work with begin to offer the offsets I'm talking about, not necessarily the market. And I've had clients not want to be a part of that, kind of questioning whether a voluntary approach to carbon offsetting is the right way to go and how that industry is run in general. But I don't have much to say, honestly, about it. Just not a big area of my focus.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the time. When I was previously, like a few years ago, looking at the ESG holdings and like what it would take for like major corporations to be included in some of those like larger holdings, I think that's from like the BlackRocks of the world. And I think what became not that surprising, but maybe a little disappointing, was like we're so overweighted on like tech stocks and like the Microsofts of the world in order to still generate like some kind of like steady stream of short-term returns. While like the lion's share of the criteria to be included was kind of what we were talking about like exclusionary criteria. Like as long as you weren't like selling tobacco, like you weren't a cigarette company, like you weren't selling alcohol, like, or working in defense, like you could essentially cross the threshold and be included within some of these holding companies. I feel like in the past 2 years, like some of the mentality, as you've been like, articulating, has evolved surrounding this. But I'm curious how like the broader like investor sentiment is. I'm still striking that balance between like short-term returns and like how you've been navigating that beyond what you mentioned about like articulating like the near-term like challenges and hurdles that people are like might not anticipate with like what's happening with these technologies and why they're not returning sooner. So yeah, I think just more curious to get your view on that evolution and like what direction that might be going in.
That's a big question.
Any reaction would be
Yeah. If your product is designed for prioritizing a return, you're going to design a product to back into the return you're trying to hit, right? So that's sort of like, why do people invest money? If the assumption is you're investing money to prioritize return always, then products will be designed around that. I think there are products that are designed, like investment products that are designed to, this is where we get into the greenwashing a little bit, right? So sort of say you're going to do a thing, but then what's happening under the hood? And so there's no real criteria yet, right? It's sort of like buying food that says natural. It doesn't mean anything. It's not regulated. So I think that's part of what we're seeing is like, you can have a label that says ESG on a product, but look under the hood and find things that might be shocking to many of us, because whatever the rationale is for that investment strategy, you can make sense of it. But and then it comes down to very individual conversations with, I work face to face with investors, right? So they may, on the one hand, profess certain values, but then on the other hand, really want to know why they didn't make more in a certain quarter. And we have to remind them, like, certain industries are up because certain things are in the world happening that you said you didn't want to be a part of, right? So it gets very, it can get very, on the one hand, systemic, and on the other hand, very intimate, the choices that we're making. Because at the end of the day, those are the people that are buying and signaling for these products. And the level of transparency that's required of the middlemen to really articulate the impact thesis, it can be pretty vague about it. So I think more rigor around how impact is being defined or how values alignment is being defined can make it clearer to the end users. But if you're investing in public markets and you're looking for the perfect company, you will not find one, right? But if you have the ability to design a portfolio that's super custom to your values, that's great. But if you have to work through maybe a more pooled type of tool, like a mutual fund, then you have to look at what the different mutual fund managers are offering and what they're doing or not doing. I'm trying to be a little more specific for you, but for example, the Magnificent Seven, right? These tech companies that have been really driving a boom in the stock market in the past year or so. We have some products that we offer our clients to invest in that are in those, and they're doing really well, and some products that for values reasons are intentionally divested from those industries. And so that ends up being a conversation at the end of the day. Every quarter, people are looking at their returns, and you have to, say, okay, remember, this was the value set that you selected, and this is what it looks like because it's divested from these industries, and this is what these industries are doing right now. What will these industries be doing in 1 year's time or 5 years' time? Who knows? But sometimes it's about re-anchoring, like from the chair that I sit in as an advisor with individuals making these choices. It's about re-anchoring to what they said they wanted to be doing or not doing, or what they were willing to be a part of for a certain financial return, is another way to put it.
Thanks so much. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'm just curious, when you're evaluating a new fund manager's strategy, maybe how does your approach differ from what a traditional wealth advisors would be? And then on top of that, like, what have been some interesting alternative investment strategies that you've seen recently that you find particularly interesting?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Well, at Abacus, we have a centralized body, our investment committee, run by our chief investment officers who make those decisions and have their process of due diligence. So I personally don't sit in the room when those things are happening. But I can share with you the approach that our firm does is the vast majority of our offerings are public markets. So we're talking about public market due diligence process. Something that we were early adopters of was something called the Due Diligence 2.0 commitment. I think there's a website for that, duediligencecommitment.com, and which was essentially signing on as folks who make investment decisions to commit to interpreting and assessing new managers and new funds different from the traditional way, like having more open criteria that could circumvent the classic hiccup that has resulted in like the very same people constantly getting prioritized and privileged in terms of asset allocation choices. So a common hurdle was you need to have a 3-year track record. So if you've never done a thing, how do you have a 3-year track record? So continually disadvantaged new managers and new managers in particular. So signing on to that commitment forced our investment committee to find more holistic alternative and parallel processes to vet investment opportunities and managers. So that's one thing where we're different. In terms of what that led to, maybe we worked with a group called Adasina Social Capital, ADASINA, public market investors looking at marketing for social change or investing for social change, seeing themselves as both sort of a convener of voices to define what should be the criteria that they're divesting out of from the folks that are more on the impacted side of maybe the E, the S, or the G issue, rather than say gender should be the way we know we're doing better on gender is we have more women in a boardroom. Like, why should that be a marker of progress for gender? Like, what if you asked women in the publicly listed companies what they think would be a more impactful way to make progress on issues related to gender in their companies? And that is an example where they got to actually, I think I mentioned before, forced arbitration to have my job. If there's sexual harassment, I've signed away my ability to fight it in court. And so that actually was a bigger issue to the women working in these publicly listed companies than how many women sat on the board of the company. So their approach to defining what the issues were was very different than a traditional approach that a traditional asset manager would use. That led to divestment strategies from there, but also making public the list of the companies they divested from to create pressure across the marketplace for other asset managers who might want to follow suit and also divest from that. Publicizing a data set behind that, and then that's the example that led to the legislation being signed into law. So that by being willing to think differently about which managers would get into our remit, we're actually able to see very creative and different solutions come forward and different investment opportunities. That's not something for all of our clients to be invested in, but for some clients, it's like, so what they want to do and where they want to put their money and what they want to be a part of. And so it's great to think differently because we're in times that require more creative thinking and approaches.
Hey, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks for the great questions.